Community First Developments, Inc. is very pleased to sponsor the guest speaker to the National Business Meeting. It is with great pleasure and a great deal of admiration, because the development of cooperative housing has always been a passion of Community First Developments, Inc., that I present to you Doris Koo. Doris.
Thank you for having me this afternoon. You have a proud history, an amazing history. And part of that history is not just what the numbers showed, and I just picked that up from a website somewhere that I Googled. Whether it's current or not, you'll be the judge. But I was impressed not only by the numbers, by the collective value of your assets. Even 10 years ago, your assets aggregated to almost $6 billion. But by your sense of community, by how you behave like a family, by how proud you are of who you are and where you live, and how you care deeply about preserving your communities, not just for yourself, but for those who come after you. I give you my respect and my total support that this is a legacy worth preserving. And I'd like to frame my brief remarks this afternoon in terms of three portions. One is the challenge of preserving this wonderful legacy. The second piece is what we in the States have tried to do in the midst of wholesale federal devolution from affordable housing. And then third was the brilliant brainchild, again, of CHF BC, led by Tom Armstrong and his cohorts in British Columbia, which created an entity called Social Purpose Development Partners. So yours is a productive partnership. This morning's awards showcase the strength and the power of communities. I was totally touched by the Charles Darren Housing Co-op in winning the award and exemplifying all the attributes that we all want in our community. Caring for each other, comprehensive services for the young, and helping those who need an extra step up in times of vulnerability. Yours has been a productive partnership made possible by your federal and provincial governments, as well as by the private sector lending institutions. But just like everything else in life, good things often come to an end. And from this morning's session, I heard very clearly the urgency of protecting and preserving and defending the legacy that you have built, but also the call for planning of the end of an era. In the next 3, 5, and 20 years, most of your operating agreements will end. And absolutely the most important advocacy work that you have to take on, as you already took on, is the absolute defense of protecting this wonderful concept called co-op housing, as well as the affordability that it avails to other members of your co-ops. You must all ask all levels of government to commit to a simple concept and a commitment, which in the States, we called it a no net loss commitment. No net loss of affordability, no net loss of commitment. As we grow to expand our sector and our portfolio, we must defend and protect what we have today and not let one single unit slip through or one single family fall through the safety net. Thank you. But the end of this era also means that $6 to $8 billion in real estate assets will be released to local control. And I want you to look at that bullet and remember, released to local control, meaning your control. And it's not insignificant. $6 to $8 billion of real estate assets. So, while I echo the commitment to fight for affordability and hold federal government and all levels of government accountable, I also want to echo a comment from one of your members this morning that we need to be on a dual path. The path of defense and protection, but also a strategy to look for opportunities beyond the defensiveness to think offensively so that we can innovate and we can expand. So how do you move from here on out? There will be mounting responsibilities as your housing age. They will be 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old before you know it. Roofs, boilers, plumbing, some of you are already struggling with those issues. There'll be huge challenges to defend those low-income families who will fall through the federal safety net if there's no support below it. But again, you have unparalleled opportunities, and that's what you need to really focus your attention on. And much as it would be comfortable to go home and just, sit up a little bit, pay some more attention, and do the good work, as in the wonderful victory that you scored with removing the huge refinancing penalties, or the great work of CHF BC in mounting the campaign to bring affordable housing to everyone's psyche, I would posit and suggest that you will need to face reality and by necessity find ways to innovate. And only by having that energy to find new ways to innovate will you not allow yourself to be so beat down by the pressures of loss of that subsidy to hunker down and then to just look smaller and smaller and smaller. You got to think big, think bold, and really be prepared to innovate. Now, the experience in the United States, for almost 60 years, the federal government was the sole funder of capital and operating subsidies, very similar to what you experience in this country. And the federal government has built more than 1.2 million units of public housing, which is just subsidized housing in the United States. A combination of your social housing, your cooperative housing. And somewhere in the middle, past the 1960s and 70s, these high-rise projects and public housing became concentrations of the very poor and begin, as opposed to giving people a platform to move up and out of poverty, began to untrap generations of families in unending cycles of dependency and poverty. Today, 46 million Americans live in poverty. This picture is a very distressful visual of what America ought not look like. But they are about the young, the single-headed household in towns that have their lives and their energies sucked out of them. The federal devolution from housing is complete. The federal government has stopped building new public housing for almost 30 years. In fact, some of the housing had deteriorated so poorly that they have demolished 150,000 units of public housing from 1995 to 2007. And that's more than all of the co-op housing you have in Canada combined. They have been demolished just because they were too old, too dilapidated, too past their useful life to be saved. That is what will happen if you give up on the struggle ahead. And our federal government declared that there would be a new era of public housing transformation. The federal government will no longer play an active role, whether they like to admit it or not. They have abdicated their responsibility and instead created a mechanism that's called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program and transfer the responsibility of building social housing to the private sector, to corporations, to nonprofits, and to local governments. Now, I'm going to show you a slide that's purposely complicated in small print, not meant for you to read, because the program is that complicated. I recently gave a talk at the Monk School of Global Policy at the University of Toronto, and it took me half an hour to explain how the program works. But once you understand it, it's great. It's a good program. That's not the topic today. The topic today is to look at the results of that program. In 26 years, This program has financed 2.6 million affordable housing, rental housing in the United States. Recall 2 slides ago, I said the federal government built 1.2 million in 60 years. Well, in 26, this program generated twice the number of affordable rental unit, plus leveraged $100 billion in private investment. Because without that private investment, there's just not enough cash to build that many units. And it created a whole new approach that looks at housing as real estate. Housing is no longer entitlement. Real estate has its own fundamentals that you have to respect: income, expense, reserves, location, 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 and all the rest that goes into how real estate developers in the private sector contemplate approaching building housing. It also created an approach that motivated the public sector and the private sector and nonprofits to share a mutual interest to protect these assets. This program created a whole different dynamic where nonprofit organizations now build housing and investors partner with them to invest in triple bottom line returns. Now again, program might not work in Canada. When I talked at the University of Toronto, they were buzzing about a tax credit program made in Canada and different investment tools that the Canadian tax system might be willing to contemplate. So it really doesn't work to study this program in depth because, again, other than the concept of a public-private partnership, nonprofit partners, community, and holding everyone accountable and creating mechanisms to do that, you really don't need to know much more about that. But the result is impressive because it forced, by necessity, those of us who's been in nonprofit housing to innovate. We got very productive because the private sector investors will not tolerate spending 2 years negotiating a development agreement. They want it done, negotiated, 90 days, signed up and go, because time is money. There's no luxury of wasting time. So productivity and accountability, the investors actually don't get their tax credits unless they perform, meaning finish building the units, housing people that are eligible in income, and so on and so forth. I worked on this community. It's the High Point community in Seattle, Washington. Started as a public housing community built in World War II. Started with 2,000 units. Over time, lost units because they just could not stand up anymore. And they would pull down until we were down to 875 units from 1,600 units. And that's when we decided that enough is enough. This is the new High Point. We rebuilt it back to 2,000 units, mixed income, and used a whole bunch of financing mechanisms. But the most important part was involving the communities in building the vision. I'm going to very quickly go through the slides. World War II, for defense worker housing, building warplanes at the Boeing field. After the war, deeded to the Seattle Housing Authority, run as public housing. In 60 years, dilapidated, became yards for junk cars, junk furniture, no man's land, highest homicide rate in that part of Seattle. We involved the community to come up with a vision. What are you willing to give up in order to bring new life to the community? Are you willing to live denser together? Are you willing to sell off some land for homeowners and private housing in order to bring capital to repair and maintain affordability? And under that vision, we went forward. This is pictures of reconstruction. Denser housing, pretty though. Mindful of the environment. This is a water detention pond. It's a wastewater detention pond, but it was an amenity taken by the community. Instead of front backyards, because of denser housing, we have community gardens now. Urban agriculture. The sidewalks, you can't see it here, pervious sidewalks where water will go in and through the drainage before they hit Longfellow Creek so that we can be kind to the salmon. Native vegetation, We don't need to irrigate. No need to keep lawns. It's a new community. It's a community of happy families. You too can do this. In a few years, you will no longer have the same kind of relationship with your federal government. But in a few years, you should no longer think about yourself as a small player in the housing delivery system. Just imagine that you'll be sitting collectively on a national real estate portfolio worth billions of dollars. How do you leverage is the question. How do you, as a cooperative movement and sector, pool your resources, your knowledge, your energies to make something out of what you have so that the sum of the whole will be greater than the sum of the parts? I need you to imagine, while I showcase one pilot that's called SPDP. It's a partnership. Van City Community Foundation graciously put some startup capital. That means you can ask your credit unions to consider giving you seed capital to plan. The goal is that SPDP will build development capacity. Many of you might decide that you have the opportunity to rebuild denser, sell off some land, but you don't trust the private sector developer. Well, SPDP is here for you. You can do this here, elsewhere, just like BC had. And Nick this morning talked about the City of Vancouver surplus site, so I'm not going to go into it, except just to show you some pretty pictures. Athletes Village, and another athlete village, and the view from some of the surplus sites. This is one of the 4 City of Vancouver surplus sites. Amazing view that could generate market rate housing whose rental income can then subsidize the affordable housing units. Here's another view. And the third view, which is my concluding slide, shows you that the road forward is unknown. You don't know what lies ahead, except that you see blue sky and blue water, and you can feel the fresh air in your face. This is going to be a dynamic new era. If you care to think, if you care to say, we are not going to just fall and plead for the federal government to please do your share, hell, we're going to hold you accountable for that, but we're going to find another way through the spirit of the co-op movement. It's your home, it's your community, and eventually your decision to go forward. Best of luck to you. Thank you for having me.